Hello and welcome back to Enlighten Us Arabic. You are joining us for lesson 24 and today we are looking at verb forms أو زان الأفعال. Now in Arabic there are 10 common verb forms. We have number 1, which is فعل. We have number 2, فعل. We have number 3, فاعل. We have number 4, أفعل. Number 5, تفعل. We have number 6, تفاعل. We have number 7, انفعل. Number 8, افتعل. And number 10, استفعل. And then we have number 9, افعل. Now let's have a look at how each one of these works, how it functions. Now the majority of Arabic verbs, and I can't stress this enough, have 3 letters. These are your form 1 verbs and they are the default, and we say they are على وزن فعل. Now let's have a look at some examples. We have خرج, he went out. We have لعب, he played. علم, he knew. جمع, he collected. قطع, he cut. But when we say على وزن فعل, what exactly does that mean? Bearing in mind that wazn in Arabic means weight. It means to weigh something, for instance. So to say that these verbs are على وزن فعل, it means that they're equal to. But what does that mean in practice? Well, let's have a look. So if we take each of our verbs and we take the first letter corresponds to the fa. The second letter corresponds to the ain, and the third letter in each one corresponds to the lam. And this is true across the board. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may have noted that la'iba, for instance, or alima actually have a kasra. So they don't actually correspond, they're not equal to the ain. That's because even though we say ala wazn fa'ala, for form 1, the ain can actually have kasra in some cases and a dhamma in other cases. Now let's have a look at some of the other forms. Now let's say what you want to say or what you want to express is allama. Well, this is where form 2 is useful, because what form 2 is, or its function, is that it's causative of form 1. So it causes form 1 to happen. So if we, well, what does this mean? Well, let's go back to the original verb. Now, if you remember, we saw alima with the definition or the meaning, he knew. Now, if you use form 2, so we use fa'ala as our template, we end up with allama. So initially he held knowledge, we put it through fa'ala, he passed knowledge on, he taught. And what exactly does this mean? Let's have a look again. So again, the first letter corresponds to the fa', the middle letter or the second letter corresponds to the ain, and the last letter corresponds to the lam. So what we've done here is that we've retained the ain with its fatha. The lam, on the other hand, now has a fatha. Not only has a fatha, there's 2, it has a shadda, because the ain here in fa'ala also has a shadda, and then we've retained the mim with its fatha. And that's how we've gone from alima to allama. He knew to he taught. Let's move on and look at form 3. لعب, he played with. Now, rather than just playing, rather than just he played a game, what if you wanted to express he played with? Well, this is where form 3 is useful, because what it does is that it takes the verb or the action that form 1 expresses and it makes it associative, so that it makes it that it's 2 people or more are participating in that action. So again, let's go back to our original verb. If you remember, we had لعب, he played. Let's use فعل as our template, and this is how we get لعب. And again, let's have a look at this in practice. So again, we've got the lam here corresponds to the fa, the ain corresponds to the ain, and the ba corresponds to the lam. What you'll notice is that there's an additional elif. That elongation elif has been added, and if you notice there was a kasra in la'iba, so when it was just he played on his own, but to express la'aba, we've now given the ain a fatha. Now let's have a look at form 4. So we've got akhraja. So what if rather than just saying he went out, you want to say he took out? This is where form 4 is useful, and as we've seen before, form 4 causes form 1 to happen. So you start off with your form 1 verb. So we saw kharaja, and then we use af'ala as our template, and this is how we get akhraja. So let's have a look at this in action. So again, the kha here corresponds to the fa, the ra corresponds to the ain, the jim corresponds to the lam, the additional letter is the alif or the hamza. So what happens? The first thing we do is we add a hamza, and then we retain the kha but with a sukun, and everything else stays the same. And that's how we go from kharaja, he went out, to akhraja, he took out. Let's have a look at form 5. تعلم. Well, what if we want to say he learned? Remember, we saw he knew, we saw he taught, but what about he learned? Well, this is where form 5 is useful, because this acts on form 2. So if we remind ourselves of form 2 verb, that was allama, and that was with the meaning of he taught. We use tafa'ala as our template to end up with ta'allama. What does this mean? Well, the fa here corresponds to the ain corresponds to the lam, and the lam corresponds to the mim. What have we got that's additional? The ta. So the first thing we do is we add the ta. We retain the ain with its fatha. The lam has a shadda, which is what it had before, and our mim has a fatha. And this is how we change the meaning from allama, he taught, to ta'allama, he learned. Let's have a look at the next one. Tala'aba, he mocked. Now remember, this is if you want to again add meaning and exaggerate the form 3. So tafa'ala would be the form to use as a template. Let's remind ourselves of the verb. So we had la'aba. So this was he played with. Then we have tafa'ala. This is our template. But what exactly does this mean? How does this work? Well, we started off with la'aba. Here, our lam without the alif corresponds to the fa, the ain corresponds to the ain, and the ba corresponds to the lam. We have the additional ta, so that's the first thing that we do. We retain the lam and we retain the alif because we have an alif in this particular form, and we retain the ain and the ba with their fatha to end up with tala'aba, which gives us the meaning of he mocked. So it's no longer playfully playing on equal terms. There's more of a duration, if you like. Making fun of is another way of saying that. And that's how you get that meaning, by using this particular form. Let's have a look at number 7. Now, what if we wanted to say انقطع, he separated from? This is where number 7 is useful, and it has that sort of reflexive of form 1. So let's remind ourselves of the form 1 verb. So we had قطع, which is to cut. We put this through our template in فعل, and we end up with انقطع. How does this work? So as we've seen before, aqaf corresponds to the fa, ata corresponds to the ain, ain corresponds to the lam. What are the additional letters? What are our additional letters? Our additional letters are this alif and the noon, so we add them on and we end up with inqata'a. And that's how we go from qata'a, which means he cut, to inqata'a, which has a meaning of he separated or he separated from. Now let's have a look at number 8. We've got اجتمع, he assembled. Now this is the reflexive, to get this meaning, of form 1. And let's remind ourselves of form 1, جمع, so he collected. And we use افتعل. Well, what does this mean? Well, the jim corresponds to the fa, the mim corresponds to the ain corresponds to the lam. What's additional? Well, this alif and this ta. So the first thing we do is we give the verb an alif. The jim now has a sukun. Between the jim and the mim we add the ta, and then we retain the mim and the ain to go from jama'a, he collected, to ijtama'a, he assembled. Well, what if you wanted to say he extracted? Istakhraja. This is where form 10 comes in. Istaf'ala would be the template that we would use, and that's because form 10 has a sort of seeking meaning to it. So let's go back and remind ourselves of form 1. We had kharaja, he went out. Using istaf'ala as our template, we now have istakhraja, he extracted. So we went from the meaning of he went out to he extracted. Now, whether you are talking about extracting natural minerals from the ground or a passage from a book, both those activities have an element of seeking, they have an element of looking. But what exactly does it mean to use istaf'ala as our template? Let's have a look. If you see, as we've seen before, the kha corresponds to the fa, the ra corresponds to the ain, and the jim corresponds to the lam. What do we have that's additional? And that's our alif, our sin, and our ta. So these are the first letters that we add. And then we've got our kha, but now it has a sukun, and we retain the ra and the jim as was. And that's how we go from kharaja, he went out, to istakhraja, he extracted. Now let's go back to form 9. Form 9 is an interesting one because it's specifically to do with colours. We've got our two examples here. We've got ihmarra and ikhdarra. Ihmarra means he reddened, literally he reddened, but usually what we mean in terms of meaning is he blushed. Ikhdarra, I've used it rather than he turned green because what you're usually talking about is a plant or maybe the grass outside when it's spring turning green. And our form for this is if'alla. This is the form that we use when we want to talk about the changing of colour. And what does this mean? Well, the hat here will correspond to the fa, the mim will correspond to the ain, and the ra will correspond to the lam. And as you'll notice, there's an additional shadda there, an additional alif. Similarly here, the kha corresponds to the fa, the dad corresponds to the ain, and the ra corresponds to the lam, and then there's the additional shadda to give us that meaning of changing colour. This is specifically used for when something is changing colour. Right, we have come to the end of our lesson, so let's summarise everything that we've learned. So firstly, we've been looking at verb forms. We said that there are 10 common verb forms, in that these are not the only verb forms, these are just the most common ones. In terms of the examples that we've been looking at, if you haven't noticed already, which I'm sure most of you have, we've been using the past tense, singular, masculine, third person version of the verb. We said that the vast majority of Arabic verbs are comprised of 3 letters, and then the longer verb forms that we've seen are then derived from those 3 letters. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. See you in the next one, inshallah.